When Angel turned 67, he thought he had finally learned how to slow down and savor the pace of life. He had worked hard for decades, raising a family, keeping up with his job, and pushing through the aches that came with long days on his feet. But it was only when his grandchildren began asking him to join them on walks through the park that he realized something had shifted. The first time, he tried to laugh off the stiffness in his legs. "Grandpa just needs to stretch a little," he told them with a smile. But inside, the truth weighed heavier. Each step felt slower, his muscles weaker, as if his body no longer wanted to keep up with his spirit. One evening, after climbing the stairs, Angel sat down on the edge of his bed and stared at his legs. They weren't the same legs that once carried him through soccer matches with his friends, or the long walks home when money was tight but dreams were big. These were softer, thinner, trembling when he stood too long. That night, he admitted to his wife that something was wrong. "I feel like I'm disappearing," he whispered, pressing his hand against his thigh, "like the strength I had is slipping away." And she, who had walked beside him through every storm, took his hand and said the words he needed to hear. "We'll find a way to bring it back." The turning point came with a doctor's visit. After the usual tests and questions, the physician looked at him with kind eyes but a serious tone. "Angel, what you're experiencing isn't just getting older. This is sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss. It's common, but it doesn't have to take your independence away." The word rang in his ears. Sarcopenia. It felt heavy, like a sentence he couldn't appeal. The doctor explained how muscles fade when they're not nourished properly, how strength can wither quietly until it's too late. Angel walked out of the office with a paper in his pocket, but more than that, he carried a fear he hadn't spoken aloud. What if he lost the ability to walk beside his grandchildren? For days, Angel wrestled with that fear. He remembered his own father, who had once been a strong, proud man, gradually becoming frail, each step a struggle. He remembered the sadness in his father's eyes, the way he hated being helped, the way he felt diminished by weakness. Angel had promised himself he wouldn't let life narrow him down to four walls and a chair. And yet, here he was, facing the same shadow. Nights became longer, sleep restless, his mind circling the same thought. Was this how it began, the slow unraveling of the life he wanted to keep living? It wasn't until a small moment, one most people would overlook, that Angel's journey began to turn. One morning, his granddaughter Sophia climbed into his lap with a bowl of warm porridge. "Grandma made it with something new," she said proudly. "Tiny seeds, but she says they make you strong." Angel smiled, taking a spoonful to humor her, not expecting much. The taste was nutty, comforting, a little different than the oatmeal he was used to. But as he ate, he felt a flicker of curiosity. Could food, something as humble as grains, really play a role in bringing back what age had taken? That night, he asked his wife about it. She explained that she had been reading about foods rich in protein and minerals, things that could support muscle recovery without the heaviness of meat or the difficulty of endless supplements. "They're small, but they carry strength inside them," she said softly. Angel leaned back in his chair, thinking about all the years he had dismissed grains as nothing but filler, something to keep hunger quiet, but never a true source of strength. Now, hearing her speak, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. The days that followed were filled with small experiments. Angel's wife cooked different dishes, swapping familiar staples for these grains she had discovered. Some mornings, the porridge carried a creamy, almost velvety texture. Other days, she tossed them into salads or soups. Angel found himself not only eating, but observing how his body felt after, whether the heaviness in his legs shifted even slightly. At first, it was hard to tell. Change is never immediate. But within a few weeks, something began to stir inside him. Climbing stairs didn't leave him quite as breathless. Rising from a chair felt smoother. His legs still trembled at times, but there was a spark of steadiness he hadn't felt in months. Emotion stirred alongside these changes. Hope, fragile at first, began to grow. Angel started keeping a quiet record in a small notebook, jotting down how many minutes he could walk, how his legs felt after meals, even the way his mood seemed brighter. He didn't show anyone at first. It felt too private, too delicate, as if speaking it aloud might scare it away. But in his heart, he knew he was reclaiming something precious, not just muscle, but dignity, independence, the ability to reach out and take his grandchildren's hands without hesitation. One afternoon, as he walked slowly around the garden, he noticed the sunlight catching the leaves, the hum of bees drifting through the flowers. He paused, feeling his breath steady, his body upright, and realized that he wasn't thinking about weakness. For the first time in a long while, he was simply living in the moment. And that was when it struck him. Maybe strength didn't return in grand leaps, but in quiet, steady steps, built day by day, spoonful by spoonful, choice by choice. From then on, Angel embraced the journey not as a battle to be won in haste, but as a path to walk with patience. Each meal became more than nourishment, it became an act of faith. Each small movement, whether climbing the stairs or stretching in the morning, felt like a statement. I am still here, still capable, still me. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he carried with him the quiet assurance that sometimes the answers we seek aren't hidden in faraway cures or complicated routines. Sometimes they're right there on our plates, waiting to remind us that even the smallest grains can hold the power to restore what we thought was lost. Angel never thought much about food. To him, a meal was a meal, something to fill the belly, keep the day moving, and bring the family together at the table. Bread in the morning, rice at lunch, pasta or soup at night. It was routine, comforting in its simplicity. But after turning 67, the comfort began to fade. What once felt like fuel no longer carried him the way it used to. Climbing stairs became a test of willpower, and standing up from a chair sometimes made his legs tremble as though they belonged to someone older, frailer, far removed from the man he still believed himself to be. The truth of it hit him on a quiet afternoon in his doctor's office. He had gone in for a routine checkup, not expecting anything unusual. The doctor, a woman with silver hair and a voice calm enough to still a restless heart, tapped her pen on the paper before her. Angel, she said softly, you're experiencing sarcopenia. That's age-related muscle loss. It happens to many, but it doesn't have to mean the end of your strength. The word sat heavy in his chest. Sarcopenia. He repeated it under his breath, the syllables strange, clinical, and somehow frightening. His first thought wasn't about himself, but about his grandchildren. Would he still be able to walk with them? To hold their hands firmly without faltering? When he came home that evening, he didn't know how to tell his wife. She had always been his anchor, his steadying hand through storms both big and small. But when he finally whispered, I feel like I'm losing myself, she only pressed his hand and said, then we'll find you again. Her words brought a fragile comfort like a candle lit in the dark. And yet, in the quiet of night, Angel found himself staring at the ceiling, asking the questions he'd never dared to voice before. Was weakness inevitable? Was this the beginning of decline, or was there truly a way back? The days that followed were tinged with restlessness. He began to notice things he had ignored before. The way his muscles seemed softer, the sharp contrast between the man in the mirror now and the man he had been in old photographs. He saw his father in that reflection too, remembered the sadness in his eyes when walking became a burden. Angel had promised himself he would not let life shrink him to the size of a chair, but the fear gnawed at him all the same. It was during one of these heavy days that something unexpected happened. His granddaughter Sophia, bright-eyed and endlessly curious, sat on his lap with a steaming bowl in her hands. Grandma says this makes you strong, she told him proudly, spooning some into his mouth before he could protest. The porridge tasted different from what he was used to, nutty, smooth, with a faint sweetness. He chuckled, ruffling her hair. And what is it called? She shrugged. I don't know, but she says it's special. That night, curiosity kept him awake longer than usual. He asked his wife about it, and she explained that it was made from a grain she had recently read about, one rich in proteins and minerals. It's small, she said, but sometimes small things carry the most strength. Angel leaned back, absorbing her words. All his life, he had thought of grains as filler, nothing more than background players to the main parts of a meal. But here was a suggestion that they might be something else entirely, a hidden source of renewal. In the weeks that followed, Angel began to pay closer attention. His wife experimented in the kitchen, blending these quiet grains into soups, salads, even breads. Angel, at first reluctant, grew curious with each new dish. Some days he felt no difference. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to notice a change. Rising from his chair wasn't as much of a struggle. His legs steadied quicker after a short walk. The trembling didn't vanish, but it softened, and with each small step forward, a flicker of hope stirred. He didn't tell anyone about the changes right away. It felt private, delicate, like a seedling pushing through the soil. But he started to keep a notebook, scribbling observations in crooked handwriting. Walked 10 minutes today without stopping. Less tired climbing stairs. Felt stronger holding Sophia's hand. Each note was simple, but together they formed something powerful. Proof that he wasn't helpless, that his body still held the capacity to respond, to heal, to grow. One morning, while tending to his small garden, Angel stood still for a long moment. The sunlight warmed his face, and he realized he was standing taller, straighter. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about weakness. He was simply breathing, present in the moment. That was when the truth dawned on him, quiet but certain. Strength doesn't return in leaps. It grows slowly, like the steady rise of the sun, like the unseen roots beneath the soil. And sometimes it begins not with grand gestures, but with something as small as a spoonful of grain. Angel began to see food differently after that. Each meal was no longer just sustenance, but a choice, a possibility. His wife smiled more as she cooked, encouraged by his curiosity and his newfound determination. His grandchildren cheered when he joined them in the park, even if his steps were slower than theirs. And deep inside, he carried the awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, the story of his body was not finished. That even in the face of sarcopenia, there was room for strength to return, quietly, patiently, one bite at a time. Angel had always believed that weakness was just the price of growing older. Friends at church often joked about their aching knees, their stiff backs, their struggles to carry groceries. "It's just age," they'd laugh, though beneath the laughter, he sometimes heard resignation, even fear. For a long time, Angel accepted that answer too. But once his doctor had given the word sarcopenia to his condition, he couldn't laugh it away anymore. The name itself made it real, and suddenly, he wanted to understand why it had come for him so quickly. It wasn't until he sat with his doctor again, a month later, that clarity began to form. She explained that most seniors lose strength not because their bodies betray them overnight, but because small habits quietly pile up over the years. Skipping protein at meals, choosing easy-to-digest foods that fill the belly but don't feed the muscles, sitting more than moving, sleeping poorly, stressing often. "It isn't just one thing, Angel," she told him. "It's the way the little choices stack up, unnoticed, until one day the body can't push back anymore." Angel thought about that on his walk home. He pictured himself in the small details: buttered bread for breakfast, long afternoons sitting by the window, evenings filled with television instead of stretching his legs. He had always told himself it was harmless. But now he began to see each of those choices as tiny threads, slowly weaving a net that pulled him into weakness. It wasn't just age, it was years of quiet neglect. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. At dinner that night, he pushed his plate away earlier than usual, staring at the rice and meat before him. "It's strange," he said softly to his wife, "but I never thought about what I was giving my muscles. I just thought food was food." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "We don't think about it until it matters," she said, "but maybe now is the time." Her words carried no judgment, only hope, and Angel felt a stirring in his chest. He started watching others more closely. In the park, he noticed how men his age leaned heavily on canes, how women paused often to rest on benches. He saw the tired way they lowered themselves onto seats, the way they rubbed their knees absent-mindedly. It wasn't weakness born overnight. It was a slow erosion, hidden until it became impossible to ignore. For the first time, Angel felt less alone. He was not the only one caught in this quiet unraveling, but he also wondered, if they had known sooner, could they have fought against it? One evening, his eldest son came to visit. Angel mentioned his fears, how he was worried about becoming dependent. His son listened carefully, then said, "Dad, you've always told us to work hard before it's too late. Maybe this is your chance to do the same for yourself." The words struck him deeply. Angel realized that just as he had built his life brick by brick with choices and sacrifices, he might also rebuild his strength the same way, slowly, steadily, with intention. From that day on, he began to look at his routine differently. When he poured himself a cup of coffee, he asked, "What will this do for me?" When he reached for bread, he paused, remembering the doctor's words. He didn't cut everything out at once. That wasn't his way, but he began to replace one thing at a time: a spoonful of grains at breakfast, a walk after dinner, a moment to stretch in the morning sun. Each choice felt small, but together they began to shift his perspective. It wasn't easy. Some days, his legs ached more than usual, and he wanted nothing but the comfort of his old habits. Some mornings, the grains tasted strange, unfamiliar, not like the foods he'd grown up with. But then he would remember his father, the sadness in his eyes when weakness took away his independence. Angel didn't want that story to repeat. He wanted his grandchildren to remember him not as frail, but as present, steady, strong enough to join them in life's simple joys. Weeks passed, and the changes grew subtle but real. His steps felt a little surer. His body didn't sag quite as heavily into chairs. One afternoon, while helping his granddaughter chase a ball across the yard, he realized something profound. He was laughing. Not out of politeness, not to mask discomfort, but truly laughing because his body was able to keep up for that moment. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. That night, he wrote in his notebook again, "Strength doesn't vanish in a day. And maybe, just maybe, it doesn't have to return in a day either." The realization brought him peace. Losing strength too fast wasn't just about time passing, it was about how he chose to live each day. And now, for the first time in a long while, Angel felt that he was choosing differently. Angel's journey into rediscovering his strength didn't start with dumbbells or protein shakes like everyone seemed to suggest. It started with a bowl of something so small, most people wouldn't even give it a second glance. The grain his wife had cooked that morning weeks ago had returned to their table again and again, quietly woven into soups, porridges, and salads. Angel still remembered his first skeptical thought. How could something that looked like sand possibly matter to a man losing his strength? And yet, the longer it stayed on his plate, the more it stayed on his mind. His wife explained it one evening as they sat together in the kitchen. The light was warm, the air thick with the aroma of simmering broth. She held a handful of the tiny grains in her palm and let them spill back into the jar like a soft cascade. "This is called amaranth," she said. "People don't talk about it much. It's not on supermarket shelves like rice or oats, but I've read it holds more for your muscles than you'd imagine." Angel looked at the jar, unimpressed at first, but then he thought of how he had begun to rise from chairs with less trembling, how his walks were lasting a little longer. Could this humble grain really be part of the reason? At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. Change takes time, after all, and Angel knew his small efforts to move more and eat better could also be helping. But there was something different about amaranth. His wife had told him it was rich in protein, even more than some of the foods he used to rely on. He didn't understand the science, nor did he want to. All he knew was that after eating it, he felt steady. Not energized like a young man, but nourished, filled in a way that reached beyond his stomach. The grandchildren loved it too, calling it Grandpa's Magic Porridge. That nickname stuck in Angel's heart. He smiled each time he heard it, though he never admitted how much it meant to him. There was a quiet dignity in knowing that something so overlooked could carry strength, like finding treasure in a place no one had bothered to dig. One Sunday after church, Angel met his old friend Thomas on the church steps. Thomas leaned heavily on his cane, his breath short. "These legs," he sighed, "they just don't want to carry me anymore." Angel hesitated, unsure how to share what he had learned without sounding foolish. But then he thought of the way his granddaughter had proudly offered him that first spoonful, unafraid of sounding silly. "Have you ever heard of amaranth?" Angel asked softly. Thomas shook his head. "Sounds like medicine," Angel chuckled. "No, it's food. Small, easy to miss. But it's been helping me." That conversation stayed with Angel. He realized that most people, like him, had never thought about grains as anything more than filler. And yet here was something ancient, quietly holding the very things older bodies cried out for. The more he ate it, the more he noticed subtle shifts. The ache in his knees softened, the heaviness in his steps lightened. It wasn't a miracle, not the kind that happened overnight. But it was a miracle of another kind, slow and faithful, like the earth giving back to those willing to trust it. One evening, his wife prepared amaranth in a way that surprised him. She cooked it in bone broth, stirred in cinnamon, and topped it with warm slices of pear. Angel closed his eyes at the first bite. It was comforting, like something his mother might have made if she'd known about such a grain. He thought of all the years he had ignored the quiet foods, chasing instead the loud promises of meat and supplements. How many of his aches had been worsened by overlooking what was right in front of him? That night, he wrote in his notebook again, "Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, waiting for you to listen." Amaranth, he realized, was one of those whispers. forgotten by most, yet powerful enough to remind him that his story was not over. Angel began to treat each spoonful with respect, as though it carried not just protein and minerals, but possibility. And in truth, it did. For the first time in years, he felt he had discovered something secret, not flashy or modern, but ancient, steady, and dependable. And perhaps that was what he needed most in this season of life. Not quick fixes, but quiet faith that the smallest changes could still rebuild what time had tried to take. Angel had never been the type to marvel at food. A meal was something to eat, not something to think about. But ever since his wife had begun adding amaranth to his plate, he found himself looking closer at those tiny seeds. They seemed so small, almost invisible against the bold colors of roasted vegetables or the deep browns of broth. And yet, they carried something that bread, rice, and pasta had never given him before, a sense of quiet power settling into his body. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table, he let a few grains roll between his fingers. "How can something so small make me feel different?" he asked aloud, half to himself, half to his wife. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's the mystery, isn't it? Sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest gifts." Her words lingered, and Angel thought about the irony. All his life, he had looked for strength in big gestures, heavy work, hearty meals, long hours. But now, in his late 60s, he was being taught that strength could come quietly, in spoonfuls rather than shovelfuls. The change was slow, but Angel couldn't deny it. His legs no longer shook as violently when he rose from a chair. He still moved carefully, but there was a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. Climbing stairs left him winded, yes, but not defeated. He began to feel like his body was responding, waking up from a long slumber. And every time he tasted that porridge, creamy and warm, he felt a small surge of hope. Not the kind that roars with excitement, but the kind that hums like a steady flame. His grandchildren noticed too. "Grandpa, you walk faster now," Sophia said one afternoon as they strolled through the park. Angel chuckled, pretending to brush it off, but inside he swelled with pride. He hadn't realized how much he missed being able to keep up, even just a little. To them, he was still the same grandfather, always present, always loving. But to himself, he felt like he was becoming more again, not less. Still, doubts crept in. One evening, while sitting with his old friend Thomas, he admitted his fear. "It feels too small, too simple," Angel confessed. "How can tiny seeds fight something as big as muscle loss?" Tomas shook his head, his cane resting against the chair. "Maybe that's the lesson, Angel. Maybe it's not about fighting big battles, but about giving your body the little things it needs every day until the battle doesn't feel so big anymore." Angel pondered those words long after his friend had gone. In his notebook, he wrote, "Small seeds, steady steps." It became almost a mantra. Whenever doubt threatened to steal his progress, he reminded himself that the body doesn't rebuild overnight. It rebuilds quietly, with patience, like a wall being restored brick by brick. And perhaps these tiny grains were his bricks, each one laid gently into the foundation of his strength. There were moments of resistance, of course. Some days he missed the taste of white rice, fluffy and familiar. Other days he longed for the ease of bread, quick and comforting. But then he would feel the tremble in his legs fade a little faster after rest, or the heaviness in his steps lift ever so slightly. And he knew the trade was worth it. What was comfort in a meal compared to the comfort of standing tall, of walking without fear of falling? His wife continued to surprise him with new recipes. Amaranth tossed into salads with roasted carrots, stirred into soups with chickpeas, or cooled and sprinkled with olive oil and herbs. Each dish tasted different, but all carried the same quiet strength. Angel found himself looking forward to meals in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't just about taste anymore, it was about possibility, about what these small seeds could give back to him. One morning, while watching the sunrise from his garden, Angel held a spoonful of amaranth porridge and thought about the journey so far. Sarcopenia had felt like a sentence, a weight dragging him toward a future of frailty. But here he was, spoon in hand, body steadier than before, spirit lighter. The seeds hadn't cured him, no, but they had reminded him that even in weakness, there is room for strength to return. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. Angel didn't think much about science. Words like amino acids and proteins felt like things best left to doctors, not to a man who had lived his life working with his hands. But one evening, as he sat in the quiet kitchen while his wife prepared dinner, she told him something that caught his attention. "You know," she said, stirring the pot slowly, "the grain you've been eating has something called lysine. It's rare in most grains, but it's important for healing muscles." Angel raised an eyebrow. "Lysine? Sounds like medicine." She smiled. "It's not medicine. It's inside the food itself. It helps rebuild what time has worn down." The word stayed with him. Lysine. He repeated it under his breath, the way he had once repeated Sarcopenia, though this time it carried hope instead of fear. Later that night, lying in bed, he thought about what his wife had said. Healing from the inside. It made sense to him, even without understanding all the details. He had always known that true repair didn't happen on the surface. When he fixed something in the house, the problem was rarely the broken hinge or the peeling paint. It was deeper, hidden in the structure. Maybe his body was no different. Over the weeks, he began to notice a difference he hadn't expected. The ache in his joints after long walks softened, and the stiffness in his shoulders when he woke each morning seemed to ease more quickly. He still moved slowly, yes, but the pain no longer lingered in the same sharp way. It was as if something beneath the surface was knitting itself back together, quietly, patiently. And each time he lifted the spoon of warm porridge to his mouth, he thought about that unseen repair, about how something so small could work in silence where he couldn't see. One afternoon, Angel found himself watching his grandchildren play outside. They were running, tumbling, laughing with the ease of bodies that knew no limitation. For a moment, he felt the sting of envy. But then, as his granddaughter called to him, asking him to join, he stood and walked toward her. His steps were slower, yes, but they were steady. And when she grabbed his hand, he realized that he wasn't just present in the moment, he was strong enough to take part in it. That realization brought tears to his eyes, though he hid them quickly behind a smile. Later that evening, he shared his feelings with his wife. "It's strange," he admitted, "but I feel like something inside me is stitching itself back together, like I'm not falling apart anymore." She nodded, her eyes gentle. "That's what healing looks like, Angel. It doesn't shout, it whispers, and you're listening now." Her words struck him deeply. He thought of all the years he had ignored his body's whispers, the fatigue, the aches, the quiet warnings. Maybe this was his second chance, a reminder that it was never too late to listen. His friend Thomas visited one weekend, and as they sat together, Angel spoke about what he had learned. "It's not about eating more, Thomas. It's about eating smarter. These little grains, they carry something our bodies still need. They don't just fill you up, they help you rebuild." Thomas looked skeptical, his cane resting across his lap. "Can food really do that?" Angel smiled faintly. "I didn't believe it either, but I can feel it. Not just in my muscles, but here." He placed a hand over his chest. "In knowing I still have strength left to uncover." The conversation stayed with him long after Thomas left. Angel realized that what he was experiencing wasn't just about food, but about hope. Lysine, protein, minerals, they were more than nutrients. They were proof that his body could still respond, still repair, still give back if he offered it the right tools. And in that knowledge, he found courage to keep moving, to keep trying, even on the days when progress felt small. One night, as the house grew quiet, Angel opened his notebook again. In his uneven handwriting, he wrote, "Healing begins inside, where no one can see, but when it comes, everyone can feel it." He closed the book and sat for a moment in silence, letting the words settle. He knew there would still be hard days ahead, moments when his legs trembled or when fatigue whispered that he should give up. But he also knew now that inside his body, something had shifted. The seeds of healing had been planted, and slowly, surely, they were taking root. Angel never expected to feel changes so quickly. When his doctor had first spoken about sarcopenia, it sounded like a lifelong shadow, something that would only get worse. But now, months into his quiet experiment with food, he began to notice something new. Not in the middle of the day when he pushed himself, but in the mornings, just after waking. For years, mornings had been his hardest hours. He would wake with stiffness in his legs, shoulders heavy, hands reluctant to move. Standing up felt like lifting a weight that wasn't there. But one morning, he sat on the edge of the bed and realized that the stiffness wasn't quite as sharp. His legs still trembled, yes, but when he pressed his feet into the floor, they steadied faster than before. It was such a small difference that anyone else might have missed it. Angel didn't. He felt it in his bones. At breakfast, he mentioned it to his wife. "It's strange," he said, stirring his bowl. "I feel better in the morning, like my body is recovering while I sleep." She smiled knowingly. "That's exactly it, Angel. Your muscles are repairing themselves overnight. All you're doing is giving them what they need to do their work." He looked at her, spoon paused in midair, and for the first time in a long time, he felt grateful not just for her cooking, but for her belief in him. She had seen strength in him even when he had doubted it himself. The thought of overnight repair fascinated him. He began to notice other things, how his heart didn't pound so hard when he climbed the stairs, how his breath returned more quickly after short walks, how his sleep felt deeper, less restless. Each morning became a test of sorts. Would the strength still be there? Would it grow? And slowly, day by day, the answer leaned toward yes. One evening, his grandson asked him to help build a small wooden toy. Angel hesitated, worried his hands might ache or tremble. But as he held the small hammer and tapped the pieces into place, he realized his grip was steadier. His grandson's eyes lit up. "Grandpa, you're strong," he exclaimed. Angel laughed, a sound filled with relief and pride. He hadn't realized how deeply he had missed hearing those words, strong. The truth, he thought, wasn't that he was becoming a young man again. He wasn't chasing the strength of his 30s or 40s. No, what he was gaining now was different. It was the kind of strength that let him stand without fear, that let him walk with confidence, that let him feel capable of living without leaning too heavily on others. And every morning when he woke with less stiffness, it felt like proof that the body, even at 67, had not given up on him. But there were still nights of doubt. Sometimes he lay awake, wondering if the progress would last. What if this was temporary? What if one morning he woke and the stiffness returned with vengeance? He confessed this to his wife one evening. She reached for his hand and said gently, "Strength isn't about never falling back, Angel. It's about rising again, knowing your body remembers how to heal, even if it takes the night to do it." Her words soothed him, reminding him that progress didn't have to be perfect to be real. As weeks passed, he noticed a rhythm forming. Each night, he ate his quiet meals of grains, vegetables, and broth. Each night, he rested a little easier, and each morning, his body gave back a little more. It wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, and that steadiness felt like a miracle. It taught him patience, taught him to value the small shifts that most people overlook. One morning, while sitting in the garden with the sun warming his face, Angel thought back to the man he had been just a few months ago. Fearful, resigned, convinced that weakness was his new reality. He smiled to himself. That man was still here, yes, but he had changed. He had learned that rebuilding didn't always come from effort alone. Sometimes it came quietly, in the night, while the body worked unseen. Sometimes healing was not about fighting harder, but about giving the body what it needed and letting it do the rest. That evening, in his notebook, he wrote, "Strength returns in the silence of night, in the patience of sleep, in the gifts of food that heal when I cannot see." It was a reminder to himself, but also a promise, that he would not take these changes for granted. He would continue, night after night, trusting the unseen work that was giving him back his mornings, his steadiness, his life. Angel had lived with cold feet for years. At first, he blamed it on the weather or on shoes that had grown old and thin. But even in the warm months, his legs often felt heavy, his toes numb, as if the blood flowing through them had slowed to a crawl. He tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to notice when every step carried a dull ache or when he had to rub his calves at night just to feel relief. "It's just old age," he told himself. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. One Sunday, after service, Angel lingered with his friend Thomas, who leaned on his cane and sighed about his legs. "They feel frozen," Thomas muttered, "like the blood just doesn't want to reach them anymore." Angel nodded, understanding too well. But then he remembered something his wife had been cooking lately, another grain, different from the amaranth, with a nutty smell that filled the kitchen. She had called it buckwheat. He hadn't thought much of it at first, but when she explained it helped with circulation, he had begun to wonder. That evening, over dinner, he asked her again, "You said buckwheat helps the blood flow, didn't you?" She nodded, setting down her fork. "Yes, Angel, it's not wheat, even though the name confuses people. It has something inside that strengthens your veins, helps your blood move better." He sat quietly for a moment, chewing slowly. Could something so simple really ease the cold in his legs? He didn't know, but he was willing to try. The days that followed brought quiet surprises. His wife cooked buckwheat groats, simmered until fluffy, tossed with herbs and roasted vegetables. At first, Angel thought of it as just another grain, filling his plate like rice or quinoa. But after a few weeks, he noticed something unexpected. His legs didn't ache as much during walks. The heaviness seemed to lift a little sooner, and the biting cold at night softened into warmth. He couldn't say it was only the food, but he felt the difference all the same. One afternoon, while walking in the park, his granddaughter slipped her hand into his. "Grandpa, your hand isn't cold today," she said with delight. Angel laughed, a little embarrassed, but inside the comment struck him deeply. For years, he had accepted that cold hands and legs were just another sign of age. But here, in the simple touch of his granddaughter's hand, was proof that something had changed. Encouraged, he continued. His wife experimented more with buckwheat, pancakes in the morning, porridge with cinnamon and honey, even flour for baking. Angel found himself enjoying the variety, but more than that, he began to trust it. Each meal felt like another step toward restoring the warmth in his body, another way to push back against the chill of weakness. Still, doubt lingered. One night, as he rubbed his calves, he wondered aloud, "Can food really do this, Maria? Can it really warm my legs?" She looked at him with that steady gaze she had always carried. "Angel, food is life. It carries what our bodies need, even when we've forgotten. You're only remembering now." He thought about her words long after she had fallen asleep, letting them sink into the quiet spaces of his mind. Weeks passed, and the change grew clearer. Angel found himself walking longer before needing to rest. The cold that once spread through his legs on winter evenings now faded more quickly after he sat by the fire. His body was responding, not in grand leaps, but in small, steady whispers of renewal. And each time he felt warmth returning to his legs, he silently gave thanks for the grain that had been overlooked for so long. One afternoon, as he and Thomas sat outside together, Angel spoke about buckwheat. "It's helping me," he admitted, almost shyly. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Food? Helping your legs?" Angel nodded. "Not just food, something steady, something alive. You should try it." His friend laughed at first, but Angel didn't mind. He knew what he felt, and he knew the difference it was making. That evening, Angel opened his notebook once again and wrote, "Warmth returns not with fire, but with what we place on our plate. The smallest seeds can carry heat into the coldest places." It was a simple reflection, but it carried the weight of what he was living. His legs, once so tired and chilled, were slowly becoming alive again. And with every warm step he took, Angel felt closer to the man he wanted to remain. Present, capable, steady enough to walk beside those he loved. Angel had grown used to the quiet burn in his joints. It wasn't sharp like the pain of an injury, but a dull, persistent throb that followed him through his days. Some mornings it sat heavy in his knees, other times it crept into his shoulders or hips. He tried not to complain, but when he struggled to lift his granddaughter or hesitated before bending to tie his shoes, the weight of it settled on him. It felt as though a small fire lived inside his body, flaring with each movement, reminding him of what age had taken. One evening, while stirring a pot of soup, his wife spoke gently. "Do you know why these grains are helping you, Angel?" He shook his head, watching the steam rise. She explained that beyond their protein, they carried something else, compounds that calm the body's hidden flames. "It's called inflammation," she said, "and it's one of the reasons your muscles ache. These grains fight it quietly so your body can rest." Angel listened, struck by the thought. All his life, he had thought food was just fuel. Now he was learning it could also be medicine, working in places he couldn't see. The change didn't happen overnight, but it was real. He began to notice that the deep aches after long walks faded more quickly. His hands, once stiff in the mornings, loosened with greater ease. Even the soreness in his back seemed less punishing. Angel marveled at how something as ordinary as buckwheat or quinoa could bring relief where he had only expected decline. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was enough to remind him that his body still had the ability to recover. One afternoon, he sat outside with Thomas, who winced as he shifted in his chair. "The pain never leaves," Thomas muttered, rubbing his knees. Angel looked at him, remembering how he had once felt the same. "Maybe it doesn't have to stay as strong," Angel offered. "I've been eating differently. It hasn't erased the pain, but it's softened it." Thomas chuckled. "Food? Softening pain?" Angel nodded slowly. "Not all food. The right food. The kind that doesn't just fill you up, but calms what burns inside." That night, Angel thought about the years he had relied on pain creams and pills, believing they were the only answer. They dulled the ache for a while, but the fire always returned. Now, as he sat at the table eating a warm bowl of grains with roasted vegetables, he felt something different, relief that came not from masking the pain, but from supporting his body and healing it. It was subtle, yes, but deeply meaningful. His granddaughter noticed too. "Grandpa, you bend faster now," she said one morning as he helped her pick flowers in the garden. Angel laughed, though his chest swelled with quiet pride. He hadn't realized how much he had slowed until he began to move with more ease. The small improvements stitched themselves into his daily life, transforming moments he once dreaded into moments of joy. In his notebook, he wrote, "The body burns where it is weakest. But when you feed it gently, the flames lower, and life feels lighter again." He looked at the words for a long time, thinking about how easy it would have been to accept pain as his final companion. Instead, he was learning that even at his age, change was possible. Not dramatic, not instant, but steady, like a quiet hand cooling a fever. The fire in his body still flickered from time to time, of course. There were days when he rose stiff and sore, when the aches reminded him that age was not something to escape. But now, those days felt less defeating because he knew he had something to lean on. Each meal became not just a source of energy, but a tool to soften the pain, a way to fight back against the inflammation that once ruled him. And as he sat in the evening glow, his family gathered around the table, Angel realized that healing wasn't always about removing the fire completely. Sometimes it was about learning how to calm it, how to keep it from consuming everything. And for him, that lesson had come not from medicine, but from the quiet strength of grains most people never thought twice about. Angel used to dread the walk from his front door to the park down the street. It wasn't far, barely half a mile, but for him it felt like a mountain. Each step carried a dull ache, and his legs trembled as though they belonged to a man much older. He would pause halfway, pretending to admire the flowers in a neighbor's yard just to catch his breath, though really he was trying to hide his struggle from the world. More than once, he wondered if the day would come when even that short walk would be too much for him. But slowly, almost without realizing it, things began to change. It started with the mornings. When he rose from bed, his legs no longer resisted quite as much. The stiffness that once chained him to the mattress began to loosen. Then came the afternoons when the heaviness in his calves lifted a little sooner after rest. And then, one bright morning, he reached the park gate without stopping, his breath steady, his steps firm. He stood there in disbelief, hand on the cool metal rail, and let the realization wash over him. That evening, he told his wife what had happened. "I didn't stop once," he said, his voice quiet with wonder. She smiled as though she had been expecting the news all along. "You're steadier now," she said. "Your body is remembering how to carry you." Angel nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. For months, he had feared that steadiness was gone forever. To have it return, even just a little, felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. The next day, he tested himself again. This time, he walked past the park gate, down the gravel path where the children played. His legs still tired, yes, but the sharp pain was gone. The trembling, though not completely erased, was quieter, more manageable. He stopped at a bench, not out of defeat, but simply to enjoy the laughter of his grandchildren as they ran across the grass. Sitting there, he realized that the walk was no longer a burden. It had become a bridge, connecting him back to the moments he loved most. One afternoon, his old friend Thomas joined him. Thomas leaned on his cane, wincing with each step. "I can't go far," Thomas muttered. But Angel encouraged him gently, slowing his pace so they could walk together. Halfway down the street, Thomas stopped, his breath ragged. "I can't," he said. Angel placed a hand on his shoulder. "I thought I couldn't either," he replied softly, "but it gets better, one step at a time." The words felt strange on his tongue, for they were the very words he had once needed to hear. Now, he was the one offering them. In his notebook that night, Angel wrote, "Walking used to hurt, now it heals. Each step is proof that strength is not lost, only waiting." He looked at the words, amazed at how far he had come. It wasn't long ago that fear had weighed on him heavier than any ache. But now, with each walk, that fear seemed to shrink, replaced by something steadier, stronger, hope. He still had hard days, of course. Some mornings his legs ached more than others, and sometimes the trembling returned when he pushed himself too far. But those moments no longer defined him. They were simply part of the journey, reminders that healing was not a straight road, but a winding path. And as long as he kept moving, he knew he was heading in the right direction. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air grew cool, Angel walked home from the park with his granddaughter by his side. She skipped ahead, then turned back to him, her eyes bright. "Grandpa, you walk like me now," she said proudly. Angel chuckled, his heart swelling. He didn't walk like a child, of course. His steps were slower, measured. But to her, what mattered wasn't speed, it was presence. He was there, steady, beside her. And in that moment, he realized that was all he had ever wanted, to keep walking through life with those he loved, one step at a time. Angel had grown up believing that grains were nothing but filler. Rice, bread, pasta, they were food to quiet hunger, not to build strength. He remembered his mother serving steaming bowls of white rice and saying, "It will keep you full." And it did. But fullness, he now realized, was not the same as nourishment. For years, he had dismissed grains as empty fuel, and perhaps that was why his legs had weakened without him even noticing. One evening, as he sat with his wife at the dinner table, he poked at the buckwheat on his plate and sighed. "It's strange," he said, "to think of this as anything more than just another carb." His wife looked at him knowingly. "That's the mistake we've all made, Angel. We see grains as the enemy because of sugar and belly fat. But not all grains are the same. Some don't just fill you, they feed you." Her words carried a conviction that stirred something in him. He thought of the mornings when his legs felt steadier, the evenings when his steps carried him further. Perhaps she was right. The next day, he decided to test it. He cooked himself a bowl of white rice, something he hadn't eaten much since beginning his new routine. It tasted familiar, comforting. But after lunch, the old heaviness returned. His body felt sluggish. His legs weighed down as if the energy had drained too quickly. The difference startled him. Later that evening, he ate the buckwheat again, and though it was subtle, he noticed the steadiness return. It wasn't just about calories or carbs, it was about what the food carried within it. That realization humbled him. For years, he had blamed age alone for his weakness, never once considering that what he ate could either harm or heal. Sitting in his chair by the window, he whispered to himself, "Not all carbs are equal. Some keep you alive. Others help you live." It was a distinction he had never thought to make before, and it changed the way he saw every plate of food that came before him. One afternoon, his granddaughter asked why he ate those funny little grains instead of rice. Angel smiled. "Because they don't just make me full, Sophia. They make me strong." She wrinkled her nose, unconvinced, and went back to her game. But for Angel, saying the words out loud felt important. He wasn't just eating differently because his wife told him to. He was choosing differently because he could feel the difference in his own body. His friend Thomas remained skeptical. Over coffee, Thomas said, "Angel, I don't believe food makes that big a difference. Pain is pain. Weakness is weakness." Angel leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I used to think the same. But look at me, Thomas. I'm walking further. I'm not as cold. My mornings don't punish me the way they used to. You think that's just chance?" Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. Angel smiled gently. "It isn't just another carb. It's something my body understands, something it uses to fight back. That's worth more than comfort food ever gave me." That night, Angel wrote in his notebook, "Carbs fill, grains heal. The difference is life itself." He underlined the words twice, wanting to remember them. For the first time in decades, he felt like food was not an enemy to resist or a temptation to avoid. It was an ally, waiting for him to notice its quiet power. Meals became more meaningful after that. When his wife set down a bowl of buckwheat or quinoa, Angel no longer saw it as a substitute for rice or bread. He saw it as medicine disguised as dinner, a gift disguised as something ordinary. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that healing didn't always come wrapped in labels or bottles. Sometimes it came in the humblest forms, hidden in what most people dismissed as just another carb. Angel had always thought of his legs as the pillars that carried his life. They had once been strong, steady, capable of walking miles without complaint. But in recent years, they had betrayed him. His calves cramped after only a short stroll, his feet turned icy even on warm days, and there were evenings when he rubbed his thighs until they ached, desperate for relief. He didn't have the words for it, but he knew the blood simply wasn't moving the way it once had. Then came buckwheat. At first, it was just another experiment his wife slipped onto his plate, small triangular grains cooked until fluffy and nutty. He ate them without thinking, grateful for her care, but skeptical of their worth. Yet over time, he noticed something he hadn't expected. His legs no longer felt as heavy when he climbed the stairs. The cold in his feet faded sooner at night. And when he walked to the park, there was a new lightness, as if his body was finally receiving the fuel it had been craving. One evening, curious, he asked his wife what made buckwheat so different. She explained simply, "It helps your blood flow, Angel. It has something inside that strengthens your veins, keeps them open, keeps them alive." He frowned, skeptical. "Food can do that?" She nodded, her eyes steady. "Food has always done that. We just forgot." The idea fascinated him. He had never thought about circulation before, never imagined that his diet could touch something so deep inside his body. Yet as the weeks passed, the evidence grew undeniable. The numbness in his toes softened, the cramps came less often. And though he still walked carefully, he no longer felt as though his legs belonged to someone else. They were his again, steady and warm. One afternoon, walking in the park, his granddaughter tugged on his sleeve. "Grandpa, your steps sound strong," she said, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. Angel laughed, moved by her innocent observation. She didn't know how much those words meant, how they reminded him that the changes weren't just in his mind. His body was showing the proof in each step, in each stride that no longer felt like a battle. Later that week, Thomas visited, cane in hand, his legs restless with discomfort. "They swell," Thomas muttered, "no matter what I do." Angel leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "I've been eating buckwheat. It sounds simple, but it's helping me. Maybe it could help you too." Thomas chuckled bitterly. "Food, helping blood flow?" Angel smiled. "I thought it was foolish too, but my legs, they feel different, lighter, warmer." He didn't press further, but he hoped his friend heard the sincerity in his voice. That night, Angel opened his notebook again and wrote, "Strength is not only in the muscles, but in the rivers that feed them. Keep the blood flowing and life keeps moving." He stared at the words for a long time, realizing just how true they were. His body wasn't only rebuilding muscle, it was rediscovering circulation, the lifeblood of every step. The more his wife cooked with buckwheat, the more Angel welcomed it. Pancakes in the morning, porridge with cinnamon in the evening, groats tossed into warm salads. Each dish carried not just nourishment, but reassurance. He began to see buckwheat as more than food. It was a companion, one that reminded him that even the most silent struggles, like poor circulation, could be softened with care. One cool evening, as he walked home under the fading light, Angel felt warmth in his legs that carried him all the way to his doorstep. He paused there, his hand on the railing, and whispered softly, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was thanking the grain, his wife, or life itself. Perhaps all three. All he knew was that the rivers within him were flowing again, and with them, a sense of hope he thought he had lost forever. Angel had always thought healing belonged to the world of doctors, hospitals, and medicine. When something went wrong, you sought a prescription, not a recipe. But as he grew older, he began to realize that healing could also be found in the simplest of places. In the soil, in the seeds, in foods that had been eaten long before modern medicine existed. This truth became clear to him one evening when his wife placed a bowl of quinoa before him and said, "This is ancient, Angel. People have been eating it for thousands of years, and it's still here, still giving strength." He stared at the small, pearly grains, unconvinced. "If it's so powerful," he asked, "why don't we hear about it more often?" She smiled knowingly. "Because sometimes the oldest truths are the ones we forget the fastest." He thought about that as he took his first spoonful. The taste was subtle, nutty, comforting. It didn't feel like medicine, but it carried a sense of history, as though each bite connected him to generations long before his own. Over the following weeks, Angel began to see what his wife meant. His mornings continued to improve, his legs carried him with more steadiness, and even his mood felt lighter. It wasn't that quinoa was a miracle in itself, but rather that it seemed to remind his body how to work as it once had. The aches were less sharp, the fatigue less punishing. Healing, he realized, didn't always come in bottles. Sometimes it came through foods that had sustained humanity for centuries, waiting quietly to be rediscovered. One afternoon, as Angel sat in the park, an old memory came back to him. He remembered his grandmother, bent with age but still strong, grinding seeds by hand to make meals that smelled rich and earthy. At the time, he had dismissed her cooking as old-fashioned, even primitive. But now, decades later, he understood. She had been feeding the family with foods that carried not just calories, but strength. Foods rooted in tradition, in survival, in healing passed down through generations. That evening, he told his wife about the memory. "Maybe my grandmother knew something I didn't," he said softly. She nodded. They didn't need science to tell them. They knew by living, by watching, by trusting the gifts the earth gave them. Angel felt a pang of humility. He had spent much of his life chasing modern conveniences, processed foods, easy meals, fast energy. But those things had left him weaker, not stronger. Now, here he was, circling back to what was ancient, finding that the answers had been waiting all along. The shift wasn't only physical, it was emotional too. Angel began to feel a new sense of belonging, as though he were part of a larger story. Each time he ate these grains, he felt connected not only to his own healing, but to the healing of countless others before him. There was comfort in knowing that what worked centuries ago still worked now, that age-old wisdom hadn't lost its power simply because the world had grown louder. One evening, Thomas came by, his face drawn with fatigue. "I don't think I'll ever feel better," he said bitterly. Angel looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Do you know what I've learned, Thomas? Healing isn't always about what's new. Sometimes it's about remembering what we've forgotten. These grains, amaranth, buckwheat, quinoa, they've been here longer than us. And they're still here because they work." Thomas shook his head, unconvinced. But Angel could see the seed of curiosity flicker in his friend's eyes. That night, Angel wrote in his notebook, "Ancient food, modern healing. The past has not abandoned us. It waits quietly, ready to teach us again." He underlined the words, feeling the truth of them settle deep within him. For the first time in years, he no longer felt betrayed by his body. Instead, he felt guided by something greater, a wisdom older than him, older even than his father or grandmother. The next morning, as he spooned warm quinoa into his bowl, Angel felt a quiet gratitude, not just for the food itself, but for the way it reminded him that healing didn't need to be complicated. Sometimes it was as simple as honoring what had always been there, and with each bite, he carried that ancient strength into his day, letting it rebuild not only his muscles, but his faith in the life still ahead of him. When Angel first heard the word quinoa, he thought it was a food for younger people, the kind he saw in glossy magazines or health cafes. To him, it seemed like a passing trend, one of those things city folk ate to feel modern. He had even chuckled once, overhearing a couple at the market debate how to pronounce it. Quinoa, quinoa. It all sounded like a fad, something that would fade as quickly as it had arrived. But his wife, ever steady, brought it into their home with quiet determination. "Don't think of it as a trend," she told him, placing a steaming bowl in front of him. "Think of it as food, real food." Angel eyed it with suspicion. The little round grains looked odd, almost too clean, too deliberate. But he trusted her, so he lifted a spoonful to his mouth. To his surprise, it tasted nutty, warm and familiar in a way he hadn't expected. At first, he thought little of it, but weeks later, he began to notice something remarkable. His legs didn't ache as sharply after longer walks. The trembling that once made him cautious when standing from a chair seemed to fade more quickly. Even his energy, usually drained by evening, held steady through the day. He asked his wife what made quinoa different, and she explained in her simple way, "It's complete, Angel. It has everything your muscles need, not just some of it." Those words stayed with him. Complete. He thought about all the times he had eaten food that filled his belly but left him empty of strength. Bread, rice, sweets, even meat when cooked too heavily. They gave him energy for a moment, but not the kind that lasted, not the kind that rebuilt what was broken. But this small, unassuming grain seemed to give back more than it took. It didn't feel like a fad anymore. It felt like a key, unlocking something his body had been waiting for. One evening, while sitting in the garden, his granddaughter climbed into his lap and asked why he ate that funny food. Angel chuckled. "Because it helps me walk with you," he said simply. She seemed satisfied with that answer, and in truth, it was the only answer he needed. Food didn't have to be fashionable or trendy. It only had to bring him closer to the life he wanted. Steady steps, warm hands, laughter in the park. His friend Thomas remained doubtful. Over tea one afternoon, Thomas shook his head. "Quinoa? That's for young people trying to be clever." Angel smiled softly. "That's what I thought too. But it's not a trend, Thomas. It's old. Older than us. Older than our fathers. People ate it long before we forgot about it. And it's helping me now." Thomas looked away, unconvinced, but Angel didn't push. He had learned that some truths couldn't be argued, only lived. In his notebook that night, Angel wrote, "Not all that looks new is shallow. Some things return to us wearing new names, reminding us of what we once knew." He stared at the words for a long time, realizing how often he had dismissed things that seemed unfamiliar. But now his own body was teaching him to look deeper, to trust not appearances, but results. Over time, quinoa became less of a curiosity and more of a companion. His wife prepared it in countless ways: warm porridge with cinnamon in the mornings, tossed with vegetables at lunch, even chilled in salads for hot days. Each meal carried the same steady gift: strength that lasted, relief that lingered, hope that grew. Angel no longer thought of it as trendy. To him, it was timeless. One morning, as he rose from bed with less stiffness than usual, he realized something profound. Healing wasn't about chasing what was fashionable. It was about finding what worked, no matter how it looked, no matter who talked about it. And in that moment, Angel knew that quinoa had earned its place at his table, not as a passing fad, but as a faithful ally in his journey back to strength. Angel often wondered why some foods seemed to make a difference, while others, no matter how filling, left him feeling the same. The answer came one afternoon during a quiet conversation with his doctor. She leaned back in her chair, hands folded, and said, "Angel, inside your body there's something like a switch. It tells your muscles when to grow, when to repair, but as we age, that switch becomes harder to turn on. That's why even when older adults eat protein, the body doesn't always use it the way it should. Quinoa, though, it has certain amino acids that help flip that switch back on." The thought fascinated Angel. A switch inside his body, a button that could wake his muscles, one that had been ignored for too long. On the walk home, he imagined it, as if his body were a dimly lit house. The rooms were still there, the walls still standing, but many of the lights had gone out. And here was this food, this unassuming grain, carrying the power to flick those lights back on again. That night at dinner, his wife served quinoa, cooked with herbs and roasted vegetables. Angel looked at the bowl differently now, not as food, but as a key. He lifted a spoonful, tasted the nutty warmth, and thought, "This is what wakes me up inside." It wasn't magic, but it felt close enough. Over the weeks that followed, he noticed his strength returning in ways he hadn't expected. Rising from a chair felt easier, his grip steadier when he held a hammer or carried groceries. His muscles, though still thin, seemed to respond as though they remembered what to do. One morning, while helping his granddaughter in the garden, Angel bent to lift a watering can. Months ago, the weight would have made his arms shake, but now, though still heavy, it didn't defeat him. He stood taller, carried it across the yard, and poured with steady hands. His granddaughter clapped. "Grandpa, you're strong," she said, her voice filled with pride. Angel smiled, though inside he felt more than pride. He felt a quiet joy, as though some forgotten part of him had been switched back on. Tomas noticed too. When they met for coffee, Thomas studied him and said, "You move differently now, less stiff." Angel chuckled. "Maybe I found my switch." Thomas frowned, confused, and Angel explained in simple terms. "It's like my body needed a reminder to rebuild, and now it's getting it. Not from pills, not from powders, but from something that's been here all along." Thomas shook his head in wonder, though Angel could see curiosity sparking in his friend's eyes. That evening, Angel sat with his notebook and wrote, "Muscles don't die, they sleep, give them the right key, and they wake again." He underlined the words twice. For months, he had feared that his strength was gone for good, stolen by time. But now he realized it wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for the right trigger, the right signal, the right food to remind it of its purpose. Each meal became more meaningful after that. When his wife placed quinoa before him, he didn't see it as just another dish. He saw it as a signal, a message to his body. Wake up, remember, grow again. And with each passing week, his body listened more closely, his steps steadied, his arms carried more, his heart swelled with the knowledge that he wasn't powerless against age. One evening, as the family gathered around the table, Angel looked at the faces he loved, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and realized that the greatest gift of all wasn't just the strength to walk or lift, but the strength to stay present with them, steady and sure. And in that moment, he silently thanked the hidden switch inside him, and the humble food that had taught him how to flip it back on. For Angel, the word independence had always meant something simple: being able to rise when he wanted, walk where he pleased, and hold himself upright without leaning on anyone else. Yet as the years pressed on, he felt that freedom slipping. Every time his legs trembled, every time he reached for support, a shadow of fear crept in. What if I lose the ability to stand on my own? The thought haunted him more than he ever admitted aloud. But over these past months, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There were no overnight miracles, no sudden bursts of energy. Instead, it was the quiet consistency of change. Spoon by spoon, meal by meal. Amaranth in the morning, buckwheat in the afternoon, quinoa at supper. His wife had woven them into his days until they no longer felt like experiments, but like part of who he was. And little by little, Angel began to notice that independence, the thing he had feared losing, was returning. It happened first in the garden. One cool morning, he rose early to water the plants. Usually, he would ask his wife to help lift the watering can, but this time, he reached for it himself. His grip was steady, his arm sure. He carried it across the yard and poured, the weight real but not overwhelming. When he straightened, he felt a rush of something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done it alone. Later, it happened again at the park. His granddaughter ran ahead, laughing, and without hesitation, Angel followed. His legs still moved slowly, but they moved without fear. He walked the path to the gate and beyond, steady and upright, no pauses to catch his breath, no need to pretend he was simply admiring the flowers. When he reached her, she slipped her small hand into his and said, "Grandpa, you're strong again." Her words carried the weight of truth, more powerful than any doctor's reassurance. One evening, he sat with Thomas, who eyed him thoughtfully. "You seem different," Thomas said. "Lighter, stronger." Angel nodded. "I feel it. It's not about doing everything at once. It's about what you give yourself each day. Even just one spoonful, it builds, it matters." Thomas looked down at his cane, silent for a long moment. Then he whispered, "Maybe I should try." Angel smiled gently. "You should. It's never too late to take back what matters." That night, Angel opened his notebook and wrote, "Independence is not lost in a single day, nor is it regained in one. It returns in small steps, small bites, small choices, one spoon at a time." He stared at the words, letting them settle in his heart. He thought about the man he had been months ago, fearful of decline, convinced his body was slipping beyond reach. And he thought about the man he was now, steadier, more hopeful, stronger in ways that mattered most. It wasn't perfection. He still had aches, still moved more slowly than he once had, but he no longer felt fragile. He no longer feared the future with the same heavy dread, because now he knew he wasn't powerless. Every meal was a chance to choose strength. Every day was a chance to build instead of break, and that knowledge, more than anything, gave him freedom. On a warm afternoon, Angel sat in the garden with his family gathered around him. Laughter filled the air, his grandchildren running through the grass, his wife smiling beside him. He rose slowly, walked across the yard, and joined them. No hesitation, no fear, just steady steps carrying him forward. And in that moment, he realized that independence wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about having the strength to keep showing up, to stay present in the life unfolding around him. One spoon a day had given that back to him, not a miracle, not magic, but the steady gift of nourishment and patience. And as the sun dipped low, Angel whispered a prayer of gratitude for the food, for the journey, for the chance to keep walking forward with strength that was his once more. When we first met Angel, he was a man weighed down by fear of weakness, of trembling legs, of losing the independence that had carried him through a lifetime. A single doctor's word, sarcopenia, felt like a sentence. He thought strength was slipping away for good. But what began as a small spoonful of unfamiliar grain became the first step on a quiet journey of renewal. We watched Angel move from doubt to discovery. The forgotten power of amaranth softened his stiffness. Buckwheat carried warmth into his cold, tired legs. Quinoa reminded his muscles how to wake, how to rebuild, how to answer the call of life again. With each meal, he learned that strength does not roar back in great leaps. It returns in whispers, in steady steps, in the choices we make day after day. Angel's story is not about food alone. It is about hope, patience, and the reminder that healing often hides in the simplest places, in what we eat, in how we move, in the love that surrounds us. He began afraid of decline, but he ended walking steadily beside his grandchildren, notebook in hand, recording not his weakness, but his victories. And so the message is clear. Independence is never lost in a single moment, and it can be rebuilt the same way Angel did. One spoon, one step, one day at a time. If you have ever felt your strength fading, if you've ever feared becoming less, remember Angel. Remember that change is possible at any age, and that the body, given the right care, will still answer. The story of your strength is not finished. Today can be your first spoonful, your first step, your first reminder that you are still capable of more than you believe.